The hum of the Andromeda Sentinel's corridors echoed with a mechanical precision that mirrored its Zarian creator's cold, immaculate, and unyielding. Lieutenant Commander Era Vesta moved through the pristine hallways with the grace of someone who had spent her entire life embodying order. Her uniform, pressed to perfection, reflected the muted light as she approached the designated meeting chamber. Every step was deliberate, her expression unreadable. This was her realm, her sanctuary of control, and she ruled it with the discipline ingrained into every fiber of her being. But today was different. The mission briefing, though delivered with the usual Zarian efficiency, had hinted at an anomaly, a variable that she could not predict. Her counterpart for this unprecedented diplomatic endeavor was human. A race Era had only encountered through formal reports and distant observations. Their reputation, as far as she knew, was one of volatility, emotion, and unpredictability, qualities she found both intriguing and unsettling. The door to the meeting chamber slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was stark, illuminated by the bluish glow of holographic displays lining the walls. Standing in the center, hands in his pockets and a faint smirk playing on his lips, was Mark Tanis. His casual posture and unorthodox demeanor were a jarring contrast to the rigid environment. Dressed in his slightly disheveled uniform, he exuded a warmth that seemed almost inappropriate against the sterile backdrop. Era's gaze swept over him, her sharp silver eyes betraying no emotion. Mark, however, was less reserved. He studied her openly, taking in her pristine uniform, the precision of her movements, and the faint aura of authority she carried. Lieutenant Commander Era Vesta. "I presume," he said, his voice carrying a lilt of humor that she immediately found grating. He extended a hand, a human gesture she recognized but had never practiced. "Mark Tanis, at your service." Era hesitated for the briefest of moments before clasping his hand in hers, her grip firm and measured. "Lieutenant Commander," she replied curtly, her tone as cool as the room's temperature. "I trust you are prepared for the mission." Mark chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Prepared? Always. Though I have to admit, the Zarians sure know how to keep things." Interesting, his gaze lingered on her, not in a way that felt disrespectful but rather curious, as if he were trying to unravel her layers. Era stiffened. "This is not an exercise in entertainment, Commander Tanis. The success of this mission is critical, and I expect nothing less than complete professionalism." "Of course," he replied, his tone softening slightly. "But professionalism doesn't mean we can't get along, does it?" She ignored his attempt at levity, turning her attention to the holographic map projected onto the table between them. The mission details unfolded with Zarian precision, outlining the trajectory of their joint operation. Era began briefing him, her voice clipped and efficient, while Mark listened attentively, though his occasional nods and faint smiles suggested a mind that was processing the information in a way she couldn't quite decipher. As they delved deeper into the mission's intricacies, their differences became glaringly apparent. Era operated with a strict adherence to protocol, her strategies meticulous and devoid of unnecessary risk. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on improvisation, proposing alternatives that, to her, bordered on recklessness. "Your plan assumes the smugglers will act predictably," he said, leaning against the table with an ease that irked her. "But if they're smart, and I'm guessing they are, they'll anticipate a standard approach. We need to be flexible, adapt on the fly." "Flexibility leads to errors," she countered, her tone sharp. "Precision ensures success." "Precision's great," he shot back, his smile never quite leaving his face. "But out here, sometimes a little chaos works wonders." Their exchange crackled with unspoken tension, each of them firmly rooted in their respective philosophies. Yet beneath the surface, something else flickered, a curiosity, a sense of possibility neither was ready to acknowledge. As the meeting progressed, Era found herself studying him in moments when his attention was elsewhere. There was a certain confidence in the way he carried himself, a fluidity that seemed at odds with her rigid world. It wasn't just his demeanor, it was the warmth he radiated, an openness that felt almost alien to her. and yet she couldn't entirely dismiss the value in his perspective, as much as it grated against her instincts. For Mark, Era was an enigma wrapped in armor. Her precision, her stoic demeanor, and the faint aura of control she exuded all fascinated him. She was unlike anyone he had ever worked with, and he couldn't help but wonder what lay beneath that meticulously crafted exterior. Their meeting concluded with a sense of unresolved tension, both professional and personal. As they left the chamber, walking side by side through the corridor, Mark broke the silence. "You know," he said, his tone lighter now, "I think this might actually work." Era glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "What might work, Commander? You and me. Working together. Sure, we're different, but maybe that's a good thing." Her steps faltered for the briefest of moments before she recovered, her voice as measured as ever. "Differences are not inherently beneficial. They can just as easily lead to failure." "True," he admitted, a grin tugging at the corners of his lips. "But they can also lead to something unexpected. And unexpected isn't always bad." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed ahead. But as they reached the end of the corridor and parted ways, Era found herself turning his words over in her mind. Unexpected. It was a concept she wasn't entirely comfortable with, and yet for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. In the cold, sterile corridors of the Andromeda Sentinel, the meeting of opposites had set the stage for a journey neither of them fully understood. Conflict was inevitable, but so too was the possibility of something more, a connection that defied logic, rooted in the very differences that threatened to drive them apart. Era's steps echoed softly in the corridor as she made her way to the command deck. Her mind was a whirlwind of tactical calculations and strategic forecasts, trying to account for every possible variable in the upcoming mission. The meeting with Mark lingered in her thoughts longer than she cared to admit. His casual demeanor and unpredictable suggestions unsettled her, not because they lacked merit, but because they challenged the very foundation of her Zarian training. Yet she couldn't deny that his perspective, however unorthodox, might hold some value in navigating the uncertainties ahead. The command deck hummed with activity as they approached the edge of the neutral star system. The asteroid field stretched before them, a labyrinth of spinning rocks and debris bathed in the pale glow of the system's distant sun. Era stood at the helm, her posture as rigid as ever, while Mark took his place beside her, leaning slightly against the console in his usual relaxed manner. The cloaked vessel was last detected entering this region, Era began, her voice precise and measured. Its trajectory suggests a course that takes advantage of the asteroid field's natural cover. We will need to maneuver carefully to avoid detection. Mark studied the holographic map projected before them, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Carefully, sure," he replied, "but we'll also need to anticipate their moves. If they're cloaked, they'll try to stay unpredictable. Sticking to a rigid pattern might make us an easier target than them." Era's gaze flicked to him briefly, her expression unreadable. "Your input is noted, Commander, but Zarian protocols are designed to minimize risk." "And sometimes risk is unavoidable," Mark countered, his tone calm but firm. "We need to think like smugglers, not soldiers. If they're using the asteroids, they'll likely have fallback points, places they can duck into if things get hot. We should focus on those." For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the map. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, she adjusted the tactical display to highlight potential fallback points. It was a small concession, but one that didn't go unnoticed. The Sentinel slid into the asteroid field, its sleek frame weaving deftly through the labyrinth of rock and ice. The tension on the command deck was palpable as the crew worked in synchronized precision, each movement a testament to Zarian discipline. Mark, however, broke the silence with occasional observations, his tone calm yet infused with a certain vitality that contrasted sharply with the cold efficiency around him. "Incoming debris at 2:00, he called out, his sharp eyes catching a large fragment tumbling toward them. "Adjust 5 degrees starboard." Era hesitated for a fraction of a second before relaying the command. The ship veered smoothly, avoiding the collision by a narrow margin. She glanced at Mark, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. The cloaked vessel revealed itself in the form of a faint distortion on their scanners, a shimmer in the void that betrayed its presence among the asteroids. Era's fingers danced across the console as she issued orders, her voice sharp and commanding. The Sentinel surged forward, its weapon systems primed. "They're not going to make it easy," Mark said, his tone laced with anticipation. "They'll try to lose us in the field. We need to cut off their escape routes." Era nodded curtly. "Agreed. Deploy intercept drones to block their likely paths. We will force them into a corner." The chase that ensued was a blur of rapid maneuvers and split-second decisions. The smuggler's vessel darted through the field with a reckless abandon that mirrored Mark's earlier suggestions. Era's grip tightened on the console as the Sentinel pursued, her mind racing to calculate trajectories and anticipate the enemy's moves. She couldn't ignore the way Mark seamlessly adapted to the chaos, his quick thinking and intuitive calls proving invaluable. "Debris cluster ahead," Mark warned, his voice cutting through the tension. "They'll use it to shake us. Suggest we split our fire to scatter the cluster before they reach it." Era hesitated, her instincts urging caution. But something in Mark's tone, confident yet measured, made her give the order. The Sentinel's weapons fired in a precise volley, breaking apart the cluster just as the smugglers attempted to use it as cover. The maneuver worked, forcing the vessel into a more predictable path. "You're full of surprises, Commander," she said, the faintest trace of acknowledgement in her tone. Mark flashed her a quick smile. "It's all part of the charm." As the pursuit continued, Era found herself reevaluating her initial impressions of Mark. His methods were unconventional, yes, but there was a precision to his chaos that she hadn't expected. He was not as reckless as she had assumed. There was a strategy beneath his improvisation, a depth that challenged her preconceived notions. The smugglers, cornered and desperate, attempted a final gambit, a sudden, erratic dive into a dense cluster of asteroids. The Sentinel followed, its sleek frame pushing the limits of its agility. Alarms blared as the ship narrowly avoided collision after collision, the tension on the command deck reaching its peak. "Steady," Era commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We have them." Mark's hands moved deftly over the controls, his focus unwavering. "Almost there. Just need to got it," he grinned as the Sentinel's weapons leapt onto the cloaked vessel. A precise shot disabled its engines, leaving it dead in the water. The bridge erupted into a brief moment of celebration, but Era's focus remained on the display. She glanced at Mark, her expression unreadable. "Good work, Commander." "You too," he replied, his grin softening into something more sincere. "Looks like we make a decent team." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on the now disabled smuggler vessel. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that perhaps there was merit in his approach and adaptability that complemented her precision. Later, as the Sentinel's crew worked to secure the captured vessel, Era and Mark found themselves alone on the observation deck. The vast expanse of the asteroid field stretched before them, a mesmerizing tapestry of light and shadow. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with an unspoken understanding. "You surprised me back there," Era admitted finally, her voice softer than usual. "Your methods. They're unconventional, but effective." Mark leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the stars. "And you surprised me too. You're not as rigid as you seem." She raised an eyebrow, a faint hint of amusement flickering across her features. "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment or an insult." "Definitely a compliment," he replied with a chuckle. "You're more adaptable than you give yourself credit for. And that's a good thing. Out here, it's what keeps us alive." Era didn't respond immediately, her eyes drawn to the endless expanse beyond the glass. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Perhaps there was more to be gained from this partnership than she had anticipated. Perhaps, in the chaos of humanity, there was a strength she had yet to fully understand. As they stood together, the silence between them no longer felt cold or distant. It was something else entirely, something that hinted at the beginnings of trust. And in the void of space, trust was a rare and precious thing. The observation deck was quiet, save for the faint hum of the Sentinel's engines vibrating through the metal floor. Era stood motionless, her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the vast expanse of space beyond the reinforced glass. The asteroid field was behind them now, replaced by an endless canvas of stars. They seemed colder tonight, distant and unattainable, much like the thoughts swirling in her mind. She couldn't explain why she had lingered here after the mission briefing had concluded. Her quarters offered a controlled sanctuary, the perfect environment to process the day's events and prepare for the next stage of the mission. Yet she had come here instead, drawn by a need she didn't fully understand. The stillness of the deck offered no answers, only reflections she wasn't ready to face. The sound of the door sliding open broke the silence. Era didn't need to turn to know who it was. Mark's footsteps were light, almost casual, as he approached, his presence warm and unmistakably human in a space designed for Zarian precision. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Era hesitated, her gaze remaining on the stars. "Sleep is irrelevant when there is work to be done," Mark chuckled, the sound low and easy. "You know, most people would call that a deflection." "Most people," she replied, finally glancing at him, "are not Zarian." Mark leaned against the railing beside her, his arms crossed as he followed her gaze to the stars. "True. But I'm not most people either, am I?" Era's lips pressed into a thin line, but there was no real heat in her expression. He had a way of disarming her, of breaking through the layers she had spent a lifetime perfecting. It was infuriating, and in a way, unsettlingly refreshing. "You handled yourself well today," she said after a moment, her voice carefully neutral. "Your improvisation was effective." Was that a compliment? Mark asked, tilting his head toward her with a playful smile. It was an observation, she corrected, though the faintest flicker of amusement crossed her features. "One that does not diminish the recklessness of your methods." Mark laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'll take it. Coming from you, I'd say that's high praise." They fell into a companionable silence, the kind that only seemed to exist in the void of space. Era's gaze remained fixed on the stars, but her thoughts were a storm of contradictions. She had always prided herself on her ability to compartmentalize, to separate her emotions from her duty. And yet, since meeting Mark, those compartments had started to blur. She had noticed it during the mission, in the way his instincts had complemented her precision, in the way his steady presence had steadied her own resolve. It wasn't just his skills or his confidence, it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. "You know," Mark said, breaking the silence, "I used to think Zarians didn't feel anything. All the reports make you sound so emotionless." Era's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to face him, her silver eyes meeting his with a calm intensity. "Emotion is not absent in Zarians, Commander. It is controlled, channeled into purpose. Allowing it to dictate one's actions leads to failure." And yet, Mark said, his voice quieter now, "sometimes it's the messy, uncontrollable stuff that makes us human. That's what gives us the strength to push through when logic says we should give up." Era looked away, her expression unreadable. His words struck a chord she wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The cracks in her stoic exterior that he had noticed earlier now felt like gaping fissures, threatening to expose the vulnerability she had worked so hard to suppress. "You think our methods are flawed," she said, more a statement than a question. "I think they're different," Mark replied, leaning forward slightly. "Just like yours aren't better or worse than mine. They're just Zarian." For a long moment, Era said nothing, the silence stretching between them like the space outside. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke, her voice softer than before. "It is not easy to trust a method that defies everything you've been taught." Mark's smile was gentle, his tone understanding. "I get that. But trust isn't something you calculate, Era. It's something you choose. And sometimes it's not logical, it just is." Mark's smile was gentle, his tone understanding. I get that. But trust isn't something you calculate, Era. It's something you choose. And sometimes it's not logical, it just is. The use of her first name caught her off guard, the familiarity of it sending a ripple through her composure. She turned to face him fully, her silver eyes searching his face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. There was no mockery in his expression, no challenge, only an openness that felt both disarming and grounding. You make it sound so simple, she said quietly. It's not, Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's worth it. The silence that followed was different this time, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore. Era's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tightening against the railing. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt uncertain not about the mission, but about herself. You're not what I expected, she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite name. Mark smiled faintly. Neither are you. Era allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an admission of agreement, not entirely. But it was enough to acknowledge that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to him and to this partnership than she had anticipated. The stars stretched endlessly before them, their light cold and distant. But for the first time, Era felt something shift within her, a faint warmth that she couldn't quite place. Trust was not something she gave easily, but in this moment, standing beside Mark in the silence of the void, she found herself wondering if it was something she could learn. The alarm blared across the Andromeda Sentinel, its shrill tone piercing the quiet hum of the ship. Era was already moving, her steps brisk and purposeful as she strode onto the command deck. Mark was close behind, his usually casual demeanor replaced by a sharp focus that she was starting to recognize as his battle-ready state. The air was charged, the crew tense as they scrambled to decipher the incoming threat. Report, Era commanded, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. The tactical officer's fingers flew across the console, pulling up a visual of the incoming vessel. Unidentified ship on an intercept course. No response to hails. Configuration doesn't match any known registry. Cloaking signature, Era asked, her mind already racing through possible scenarios. Negative, the officer replied. But its weapon systems are active. They're locking onto us. Era's jaw tightened as she turned to Mark. He was already studying the display, his sharp eyes scanning the data with an intensity that mirrored her own. They're not here for pleasantries, he said. We need to assume hostile intent, agreed, Era said. Shields up. Prepare evasive maneuvers. The Sentinel lurched as the unknown vessel opened fire, its energy blasts cutting through the void with deadly precision. Era barked orders, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The ship shuddered under the impact of another volley, but the shields held. They're testing us, Mark said, his tone grim. Looking for weaknesses. Then we give them none, Era replied. Full power to engines. Flank them on their port side. Mark nodded, his hands moving deftly over the controls. The Sentinel surged forward, weaving through the barrage with a precision that was equal parts Era's calculated strategy and Mark's intuitive maneuvering. It was a dance, one that required perfect synchronization, and for the first time, Era found herself trusting Mark completely. The battle raged on. The two ships locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The Sentinel's crew moved like clockwork, executing Era's commands with the efficiency she demanded. But it was Mark's quick thinking and unorthodox tactics that kept them one step ahead. They're trying to force us into the asteroid belt, Mark warned, his hands gripping the controls tightly. We can't let them pin us down. Era nodded, her mind racing. Divert power from non-essential systems to shields. Prepare to counter their next volley. The ship shuddered again as another blast rocked the hull. Mark glanced at her, his expression tense but unwavering. You've got a plan, right? I always have a plan, she said, a faint edge of determination in her voice. And I need you to trust it. Trust works both ways, he replied, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade, the weight of his words settling between them. Then Era gave a sharp nod. Then let's end this. The Sentinel banked sharply, its sleek frame cutting through the debris-strewn void with an agility that defied its size. Era and Mark worked in unison, their movements fluid and instinctive. The unknown vessel tried to outmaneuver them, but the Sentinel anticipated every move, staying just one step ahead. As the battle reached its peak, Era saw the opening she had been waiting for. Target their weapons array, she ordered. Concentrate all firepower on their forward batteries. Mark hesitated for the briefest of moments. That's a risky play. I know, she said, her voice steady. But it will work. He glanced at her, then nodded. Let's do it. The Sentinel's weapons roared to life, unleashing a precise volley that tore through the enemy ship's defenses. The vessel shuddered under the impact, its weapons array erupting in a fiery explosion. The crew erupted into cheers, but Era's focus remained locked on the display. They're retreating, the tactical officer reported. We've disabled their main systems. Era allowed herself a brief exhale, her posture relaxing just slightly. She turned to Mark, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Good work, Commander. Right back at you, he said, his grin returning. Guess we do make a pretty good team. The tension on the command deck began to ease as the immediate danger passed. Era issued a series of orders, ensuring the Sentinel was secure before finally allowing herself to step back. Mark followed her to the observation deck, the adrenaline of the battle still thrumming in their veins. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of what they had just accomplished. Era leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the stars. Mark stood beside her, his presence solid and grounding. You trusted me back there, he said quietly. I did, she admitted, her voice soft. And it was. Not as difficult as I expected. Mark chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. That almost sounded like a compliment. Perhaps it was, she said, her tone lighter than usual. They stood in silence for a while, the stars stretching endlessly before them. Era's mind raced with thoughts she wasn't ready to voice, but one lingered above the rest, a realization that trust, once given, was not easily taken back. You know, Mark said, breaking the silence. For someone who's all about control, you're surprisingly adaptable. Era turned to him, her expression unreadable. And for someone who thrives on chaos, you're surprisingly precise. He smiled, his gaze holding hers. Maybe we balance each other out. Or maybe, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, we're both more than we appear. Mark's smile softened, his tone turning serious. You were incredible out there, Era. I've never seen anyone command a ship like that. Her gaze dropped for a moment, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. It was not just my command, it was our teamwork. He nodded, his expression earnest. That's what makes it work. Trusting each other, even when it's not easy. Era looked at him, her silver eyes searching his face. In that moment, the weight of their unspoken connection hung heavy between them. The stars outside seemed almost insignificant compared to the gravity of what lay unspoken. For the first time, Era allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been avoiding. Trust was not just a tactical necessity, it was a choice, one she had made without fully realizing it. And with it came something she couldn't fully control, something she wasn't sure she wanted to. We should return to the command deck, she said finally, her voice steady but softer than usual. Mark nodded, though he didn't move immediately. Yeah, we should. They lingered for a moment longer, the silence between them more telling than any words. Then, with a shared glance, they turned and walked back to the command deck, side by side. The battle was over, but the war within Era's heart was just beginning. And as she stepped back into the controlled chaos of her world, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again.